I was there that day. I saw everything unfold. Nobody expected what happened next, especially not from a little girl who barely reached the doorbell. But sometimes courage doesn't ask for permission. And that afternoon, in a house full of strangers dressed in expensive suits, she showed all of us what bravery really looks like. Before I continue, if stories like this inspire you, subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss the next ones. My name is Sarah, and I work as a housekeeper for the Morrison family in a quiet neighborhood in Connecticut. I've been with them for almost 5 years now, cleaning their enormous house, serving at their gatherings, basically staying invisible while their world keeps spinning. The Morrisons are wealthy, the kind of wealthy where you stop counting after a certain point. Mr. Morrison owns several tech companies. Mrs. Morrison sits on charity boards, and their son Tyler is studying at some prestigious university I can't even pronounce correctly. They're not mean people, just distant. They live in their bubble, and I live in mine. And that's how things worked until Emma came into the picture. Emma is my daughter. She's 8 years old, with dark curly hair that never stays in place no matter how much I try to tame it, and eyes that seem too big for her small face. She's tiny for her age. Always has been. The doctor says she's healthy, just petite. But kids at school don't care about medical explanations. They call her names, push her around sometimes. She never complains though. Emma has this quiet strength about her, something I've always admired, even when I worried it might break one day. That Tuesday started like any other. I dropped Emma off at school before heading to the Morrison house. It was one of those crisp autumn mornings where the air smells like burning leaves and everything feels sharp and clean. Mrs. Morrison had mentioned they were hosting an important business dinner that evening. Some potential investors from California looking to fund their new project. She wanted everything perfect, which meant I had extra work ahead of me. I spent the entire day preparing, polishing silverware until it gleamed, arranging flowers in crystal vases, making sure every surface sparkled. The house already looked like a magazine spread on a regular day, but for these dinners, it had to look absolutely flawless. Around 3 in the afternoon, the catering team arrived with trays of fancy food I couldn't identify. Those tiny portions that probably cost more than my weekly grocery bill. I helped them set up, making sure the dining room looked exactly how Mrs. Morrison wanted it. That's when my phone rang, the school. My heart immediately dropped because schools never call with good news. Emma had gotten sick, they said. Could I pick her up? I panicked. I was right in the middle of preparations. Guests were arriving in 3 hours, and Mrs. Morrison had made it very clear how important this evening was. But Emma needed me. She's my daughter. There was no question about what I had to do. I found Mrs. Morrison in her study, reviewing some documents. When I explained the situation, I saw that flash of annoyance cross her face before she composed herself. She's good at hiding her emotions. Years of practice, probably. She said yes, I could go get Emma, but I needed to be back before the guests arrived. The caterers could handle things for an hour. I thanked her, grabbed my keys, and rushed out. Emma looked pale when I picked her up from the nurse's office. Not terribly sick, just a stomachache and slight fever. The nurse said it might be something she ate, recommended rest and plenty of fluids. On the drive back, Emma leaned her head against the window, quiet as always. I explained that I had to finish work, that she'd need to stay in the small room off the kitchen, where I sometimes took my breaks. She nodded without complaining. That's Emma, always understanding, always making things easier for me, even when she shouldn't have to. Back at the Morrison house, I settled Emma on the small couch in the break room with a blanket and her backpack. She had some books in there, and I gave her my phone so she could watch videos if she got bored. I told her to stay quiet, to rest, that I'd check on her every chance I got. She promised she would. Then I went back to work, my mind split between the preparations and my sick daughter in the other room. The guests started arriving around 6:30. I watched from the kitchen as they filed in, all dressed in designer clothes, carrying expensive handbags, laughing those polite laughs that rich people do at gatherings like these. There were about 12 of them, investors and their spouses, plus the Morrisons and their son Tyler, who had come home from university for the evening. I served drinks, making myself invisible as always, just another part of the furniture. Dinner went smoothly at first. I moved between the kitchen and dining room, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates, staying in the background. The conversation flowed around topics I barely understood. Business talk mixed with gossip about people I'd never meet. I checked on Emma whenever I could, finding her each time curled up under the blanket, looking a bit better, but still pale. She smiled at me weakly each time I peeked in, and my heart ached wanting to be with her instead of serving strangers. Around 8 o'clock, something changed in the dining room. The business talk had shifted to something else, something that made my stomach tighten. I was clearing dessert plates when I heard Tyler, Mr. Morrison's son, telling a story. He was a bit drunk, his words slightly slurred, and he was talking about his volunteer work at a local community center, except he wasn't being kind about it. He described the people there as if they were characters in some amusing story, making fun of their clothes, their accents, the way they struggled with English. His friends laughed. He mimicked a woman who had asked for help filling out paperwork, exaggerating her accent, making her sound stupid. More laughter. My hands shook as I picked up plates, but I kept my face neutral. This was my job. I couldn't react. I needed this job. Then Tyler noticed me standing there. He gestured toward me with his wine glass, that careless gesture rich people do when they're about to say something they think is clever. He told his friends that this is exactly what he was talking about. These people who work service jobs, who can't do anything better, who should be grateful for whatever scraps they get. He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Everyone's eyes turned to me, and I felt myself shrinking, becoming even more invisible if that was possible. Someone at the table, a woman in a blue dress, looked uncomfortable. She cleared her throat, tried to change the subject, but Tyler was on a roll now. He talked about how people like me, he gestured again, probably never finish high school, probably have kids they can't afford, probably live off government assistance. His parents didn't stop him. They just sat there, Mr. Morrison looking stern but silent, Mrs. Morrison studying her wine glass like it held the secrets of the universe. I stood there frozen, plate still in my hands, feeling every word like a physical blow. Everything he said was designed to cut, to diminish, to make me feel less than human. And it worked. I felt smaller with each word, more worthless, more desperate. I thought about Emma in the other room, about how I needed this job to pay for her school supplies, her clothes, our rent. I thought about swallowing my pride, about just walking away, about pretending I hadn't heard any of it. But then I heard a sound that changed everything, a small cough from the doorway. I turned and saw Emma standing there, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her face still pale but her eyes fierce. She had heard everything. My daughter, who I tried so hard to protect from the cruelty of the world, had heard every single word Tyler Morrison had said about her mother. The room went quiet. Everyone turned to look at this tiny girl in the doorway, this unexpected interruption to their evening. Tyler frowned, annoyed at the disruption. Mrs. Morrison opened her mouth to say something, probably to send Emma away. But before anyone could speak, Emma took a step forward into the dining room. Her voice was small but clear when she started talking. She said her name was Emma, that she was 8 years old, and that I was her mother. She said I worked harder than anyone she knew, that I woke up at 5 every morning to make sure she had breakfast before school, that I read to her every night even when I was exhausted, that I taught her to be kind, even when others weren't kind to her. Her voice grew stronger with each word. She looked directly at Tyler, this tiny girl facing down a grown man in his own dining room. She told him that her mother had finished high school, had actually gotten a scholarship to community college, but couldn't continue because she got pregnant with Emma and chose to raise her instead. She said I could have given her up, could have made different choices, but I kept her and loved her, and worked 3 jobs at one point to give her a good life. The people at the table shifted uncomfortably. The woman in the blue dress had tears in her eyes. Tyler's face had gone red, whether from embarrassment or anger I couldn't tell, but Emma wasn't finished. She said that making fun of people who work hard, who do their best, who take care of their families, that's not being funny or clever. That's just being mean. And being mean doesn't make you better than anyone. It just makes you mean. Then she did something that broke my heart and made it sore at the same time. She walked over to me, took the plates from my shaking hands, and set them carefully on the sideboard. She took my hand in her small one and squeezed it. She told everyone in that room that I was the strongest, bravest person she knew, and that maybe they should think about what really matters before they judge people they don't know anything about. The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Morrison cleared his throat. Mrs. Morrison stared at Emma with an expression I couldn't read. Tyler looked down at his plate, his earlier confidence completely gone. The other guests exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable, not sure how to respond to being called out by an 8-year-old. But that little girl standing beside me, holding my hand, her blanket still draped over her shoulders. She had done something I couldn't do. She had stood up when it mattered. She had found courage I thought I'd lost years ago. And in that moment, even though I was terrified about what this might mean for my job, for our future, I had never been prouder of anyone in my entire life. If this story has already moved you so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, because there are other real and emotional stories you can't miss. One of the investors, an older man with grey hair sitting at the far end of the table, spoke first. He said he thought that was incredibly brave. He looked at Emma, then at me, then back at Tyler. He said that in all his years of business, he'd learned that character shows up in how you treat people who can't do anything for you. He said he wasn't sure he wanted to invest in a company run by people who lacked that basic understanding. The room erupted then, not with noise but with movement. People shifted in their seats, exchanged looks, whispered to their partners. Morrison finally found her voice and asked Emma if she'd like some water, something to eat perhaps. Emma shook her head. She said she just wanted to go back to the small room, that she didn't feel well. But she squeezed my hand one more time before letting go, and I saw in her eyes that she wasn't sorry for what she'd said. I walked Emma back to the break room, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. Once we were alone, I knelt down in front of her and asked her why she did that. She could have stayed quiet, stayed hidden. She looked at me with those big eyes and said she couldn't let that man talk about me like that. She said I always told her to stand up for what's right, even when it's scary. She said if I could be brave every single day going to work, taking care of her, dealing with everything life threw at us, then she could be brave for 5 minutes. I held her then, this tiny, fierce girl who had just defended me in front of a room full of people who could make our lives very difficult. I held her, cried quietly into her hair, while she patted my back and told me it would be okay. 8 years old and she was comforting me. 8 years old and she had more courage than I'd shown in years. I had to go back out there. The evening wasn't over. There were still guests, still work to be done. I wiped my face, straightened my uniform, and walked back into that dining room expecting the worst. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. The easy conversation from earlier was gone, replaced by a tension that made the air feel thick. Tyler had disappeared. His seat was empty, his napkin thrown on the table. Mr. Morrison was standing by the window, his back to everyone, shoulders rigid. Mrs. Morrison was attempting to salvage the evening, suggesting they move to the living room for coffee, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. The guests were already making excuses, checking watches, mentioning early meetings the next day. I started clearing the table, moving mechanically through the familiar motions. The woman in the blue dress stopped me as I reached for her plate. She touched my arm gently and apologized. She said she should have spoken up sooner, that she was ashamed she let that boy talk that way without saying anything. I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and thanked her quietly. Within 30 minutes, all the guests had left. The big evening that Mrs. Morrison had planned so carefully had fallen apart. I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes, waiting for someone to come tell me I was fired. My mind was already racing ahead, calculating how long our savings would last, where else I might find work, how I'd explain to Emma that we might have to move, change schools, start over somewhere else. Mr. Morrison came into the kitchen around 10 o'clock. I braced myself, my hands gripping the edge of the sink. He stood there for a long moment, not saying anything, just looking at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Then he asked me to sit down. That's when I knew it was over. They always ask you to sit down when they're about to deliver bad news. But he didn't fire me. Instead, he apologized. He said what his son had said was inexcusable, that he should have stopped it immediately, that he'd failed as a father, and as a human being by sitting there silently. He said Emma had taught him something important that evening, that sometimes wisdom comes from unexpected places, and that he hoped I could forgive his family's behavior. I sat there stunned. In 5 years of working for the Morrisons, Mr. Morrison had never apologized to me for anything, had barely acknowledged my existence beyond necessary instructions. Now he was sitting at the kitchen table, this powerful man in his expensive suit, telling me he was sorry. I didn't know what to do with that. He asked about Emma, if she was feeling better. I told him she was resting, that she'd probably be fine by morning. He nodded, then said something that surprised me even more. He said that if I ever needed to bring Emma to work in an emergency, there was always space for her here. He said he understood what it meant to be a working parent, even though his circumstances were obviously different from mine. He said his own mother had worked 2 jobs when he was young, before everything changed for their family. He'd forgotten that, he said. He'd let success make him forget where he came from. Then he did something that changed everything. He told me he was increasing my salary, effective immediately, not by a small amount either, by nearly 40%. He said it was long overdue, that I did excellent work and deserved proper compensation. He also said he was setting up a college fund for Emma. Nothing huge, he clarified, but enough to help when the time came. He said it was the least he could do after what happened that evening. I couldn't speak. I just sat there with tears running down my face, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't how I expected the night to end. This wasn't how the world usually worked for people like me. Good things didn't just happen because you deserved them. But here was this man, this wealthy, powerful man, telling me he was going to help make my life easier, because my 8-year-old daughter had the courage to speak up when I couldn't. Mrs. Morrison came in then. She'd been crying. I could tell from her red eyes. She sat down across from me and said she was sorry too. She said she'd been so focused on impressing the investors that she'd forgotten to raise her son with basic decency. She said watching Emma stand up like that, seeing that kind of moral courage from someone so young, it had shaken her, made her question what values they'd actually instilled in Tyler. She asked if she could meet Emma properly. I went to get her from the break room. Emma was awake, lying on the couch reading one of her books by the dim light. When I told her Mr. and Mrs. Morrison wanted to talk to her, I saw fear flash across her face. She asked if she was in trouble. I told her no. I promised her she wasn't in trouble, that everything was going to be okay. We walked back to the kitchen together, Emma's small hand gripping mine tightly. Mrs. Morrison smiled at her, a genuine smile I'd rarely seen before. She thanked Emma for what she'd said at dinner. She told her it took real bravery to speak up like that, especially to adults, especially in a situation where she could have stayed quiet and safe. She said Emma had reminded her of something important, that every person deserves respect regardless of their job or circumstances. Emma, my brave little girl who'd stood up to a room full of strangers, suddenly got shy. She mumbled that it was okay, that she just didn't like people being mean to her mom. Mrs. Morrison's eyes filled with tears again. She asked Emma what she liked to do, what her favorite subjects in school were. They talked for a few minutes, this wealthy woman and my daughter, a conversation that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. Then Tyler came back. I heard his footsteps before I saw him, heavy and reluctant. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen, hands in his pockets, looking younger than his 22 years. His earlier arrogance was completely gone. He looked at me, then at Emma, then down at his shoes. His father gestured for him to come in, to say what he'd come to say. The apology was awkward and clearly forced by his parents, but it was an apology nonetheless. Tyler said he was sorry for what he'd said, that it was wrong, that he'd had too much to drink, but that wasn't an excuse. He said he'd been showing off for his friends and hadn't thought about how his words would affect real people. He looked directly at Emma when he said he was impressed by her courage, that she'd shown more character in 5 minutes than he'd shown all evening. Emma didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him with those big serious eyes, evaluating whether he meant it. Finally, she said okay. She accepted his apology, but he should think about why he said those things even when he was drinking. She said alcohol doesn't make you mean. It just lets out what's already inside. Tyler actually smiled at that, a sad smile, and said she was right. The Morrisons offered to drive us home. It was late, they said, and Emma wasn't feeling well. I accepted, too tired to refuse, too overwhelmed by everything that had happened. During the drive, Emma fell asleep against my shoulder in the back seat. Mr. Morrison drove carefully through the quiet streets, while Mrs. Morrison sat in the passenger seat, occasionally glancing back at us. When we pulled up to our small apartment building, I felt embarrassed for a moment. The contrast between their mansion and our modest home was stark. But Mrs. Morrison just smiled and said what a nice neighborhood it was. Quiet and safe. Mr. Morrison helped me wake Emma gently and made sure we got inside safely before they drove away. That night, after I tucked Emma into bed and kissed her forehead, I sat in our tiny living room and cried. Not from sadness or fear anymore, but from relief and disbelief and gratitude. My daughter had stood up when I couldn't. She had been brave when I was too scared. And somehow, impossibly, things had turned out better than I could have imagined. The next morning, Emma's fever was gone. She woke up asking for breakfast, back to her normal self. Over cereal, she asked me if she'd done the right thing, if she should have stayed quiet like I always did. I told her she'd done exactly the right thing. I told her I was proud of her, so proud I couldn't find words big enough to express it. I told her she taught me something important, that sometimes staying silent isn't protecting yourself. It's just letting wrong things continue. She asked if I'd lose my job. I explained what had happened after she went back to the break room, about Mr. Morrison's apology, the raise, the college fund. Her eyes went wide. She said she didn't do it for rewards. She just wanted that mean man to stop talking about me like that. I told her I knew that, and that's exactly why the rewards meant something. Word spread somehow. I don't know if the investors talked or if one of the catering staff overheard, but within a week, people in our community knew the story. At Emma's school, teachers who'd barely noticed her before started smiling at her in the hallways. Other parents at pickup time would nod at me approvingly. Our landlord, who'd always been strictly business, knocked on our door one evening with a homemade cake, saying he'd heard what happened and wanted to say congratulations. The principal called me in for a meeting, and I went terrified that somehow Emma was in trouble. Instead, she told me that Emma had been chosen for the school's character award that semester. She said several teachers had nominated her even before they heard about what happened at the Morrison house, saying Emma was always kind, always helpful, always stood up for kids who were being bullied. The principal said Emma was exactly the kind of student they hoped to nurture, someone who understood that being good wasn't about being perfect or popular, but about doing the right thing even when it was hard. At the Morrison house, things changed too. Tyler went back to university but called to apologize again, more sincerely this time. He said he'd been thinking about what Emma said, that alcohol just reveals what's already inside. He said he was starting therapy, trying to figure out why he felt the need to put others down to feel superior. He said he wanted to be better. Mrs. Morrison started asking me questions about my life. Real questions, not just polite small talk. She wanted to know about Emma's interests, my own background, what dreams I'd had to put aside. We started having actual conversations during my breaks, this wealthy woman and her housekeeper, finding common ground we'd never looked for before. She told me about her own struggles, the pressure to maintain appearances, the loneliness of her world. I told her about the joy of watching Emma grow, despite our limited resources, the pride I felt in raising a good kid even when everything was hard. Mr. Morrison was true to his word about the college fund. A week after that dinner, papers arrived for me to sign, legal documents setting up an education account for Emma. When I saw the amount he deposited, I cried again. It wouldn't pay for Harvard, but it would give Emma options I'd never had. It would mean she wouldn't have to choose between education and survival the way I did. But the most unexpected change came from the community center where Tyler had been volunteering, the same one he'd mocked at dinner. The director called me a few weeks later. She said she'd heard about what happened. That word travels in small circles. She offered me a different job, one with better hours and better pay, helping coordinate programs for families like mine. She said my experience would be valuable, that I'd understand what the people coming through their doors needed, because I'd lived it. I was torn. The Morrisons had been good to me, especially after that night. Leaving felt like betrayal. But Mrs. Morrison, when I told her about the offer, insisted I take it. She said it was a better opportunity, better for me and for Emma. She said they'd miss me but wouldn't stand in my way. She said that sometimes good things lead to better things, and I deserved every good thing that came my way. My last day at the Morrison house was bittersweet. Mrs. Morrison gave me a beautiful letter of recommendation and a generous severance package I hadn't expected. She hugged me, this woman who'd barely looked at me for years, and told me to stay in touch. She said Emma had changed their family, made them look at themselves honestly, and they were grateful for it. The new job was everything the director promised. The hours meant I could drop Emma off at school and pick her up myself, something I'd rarely been able to do before. The work was meaningful, helping other parents navigate systems I understood intimately. I met other women like me, working hard, raising kids, doing their best with limited resources. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was valued. Emma thrived too. With me around more, with the stress of constant financial worry eased, she blossomed. She joined the school choir, something she'd always wanted to do but we couldn't afford before. Her confidence grew. She made more friends. But she stayed humble, stayed kind. That core of quiet strength that had always been there, just growing brighter. Sometimes I think about that night, about how close I came to just swallowing the humiliation and moving on. About how if Emma hadn't been there, hadn't heard what Tyler said, nothing would have changed. I would still be invisible, still be struggling, still be teaching my daughter through my silence that some people's cruelty just has to be endured. That Emma taught me different. She taught me that courage doesn't wait for perfect moments or perfect circumstances. Sometimes courage is just an 8-year-old girl, sick with fever, wrapped in a blanket, deciding that enough is enough. Sometimes courage is speaking up when you have every reason to stay quiet. Sometimes courage changes everything. 6 months after that dinner, something unexpected happened. I got a call from the woman in the blue dress, the one who touched my arm and apologized that night. Her name was Margaret Chen, and she was the CEO of a non-profit organization that worked with low-income families across Connecticut. She said she'd been thinking about me and Emma ever since that evening. She said she wanted to meet. We sat in a coffee shop downtown, this elegant woman in her 50s and me, still getting used to having time for coffee meetings. Margaret told me she'd been haunted by that dinner, not just by Tyler's cruelty, but by her own silence. She said she'd spent her whole career advocating for families like mine, but when it mattered, when she was right there in the room, she'd frozen. She said an 8-year-old girl had shown more courage than she had, and it forced her to examine what she was really doing with her platform. Then she made me an offer. Her organization was launching a new initiative, a speakers program where people with lived experience of poverty and struggle would share their stories at corporate events, universities, policy meetings. She said authentic voices were needed, people who could make the abstract real, who could put faces and names to statistics. She asked if I'd be interested in being one of those speakers. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the idea seemed absurd. Me, speaking in front of crowds. Me, who'd spent years trying to be invisible. I told her I wasn't anyone special, that my story wasn't unique, that thousands of women lived exactly the life I'd lived. Margaret smiled and said that was exactly the point. She said my story mattered precisely because it was common, because it represented an experience most people in power never saw or understood. I thought about it for days. The idea terrified me, but I kept coming back to Emma, to the way she'd walked into that dining room with her blanket and her fever and her enormous courage. If she could do that at 8 years old, what was my excuse? I called Margaret back and said yes. The first speaking event was at a business conference in Hartford. I stood backstage, hands shaking, wondering what I'd been thinking agreeing to this. There were 300 people in that audience, business leaders and executives, the kind of people who'd always made me feel small. But then I thought about why I was doing this. Not for me, for every other person working 2 jobs, raising kids alone, staying invisible because the alternative felt too dangerous. I told them about my life, about waking up at 5 every morning, about choosing between groceries and electricity, about the exhaustion that becomes so normal you forget what it feels like to not be tired. I told them about Emma, about raising a child in a world that judges you for being poor while simultaneously making it nearly impossible to stop being poor. I told them about that dinner at the Morrison house, about Tyler's words, about my daughter's courage. The room was silent when I finished. Then someone started clapping, and suddenly everyone was standing, applauding. I saw people wiping their eyes. After the presentation, dozens of them came up to talk to me. Some shared their own stories of struggle. Some apologized for not understanding. Some asked what they could do to help. One woman, a CFO of a manufacturing company, told me she was going to completely restructure her company's approach to hourly workers because of what I'd said. That speaking engagement led to others. Margaret's organization started booking me regularly. I spoke at universities, at corporate training sessions, at policy forums. Each time got a little easier. I learned that my voice mattered, that my experience held value, that being invisible all those years hadn't erased my worth. It had just hidden it. The Morrison family stayed in touch. Mrs. Morrison came to one of my speaking events and sat in the front row. Afterward, she told me she was proud of me, and I could tell she meant it. Tyler reached out too, now genuinely working on himself, asking if he could attend one of my talks. I said yes. He sat in the back and listened as I described that night, as I talked about how his words had felt, how they'd cut. He stayed after to apologize again, more deeply this time, with real understanding of the harm He told me he'd started volunteering at the community center for real now, not for appearances, but because he wanted to learn from people he'd spent his whole life looking down on. Emma came with me to some of the talks. She'd sit in the audience, this growing girl with her wild curly hair, and watch her mother speak to rooms full of strangers. Afterward, she'd tell me I did good, in that matter-of-fact way kids have. She didn't see it as anything extraordinary. To her, speaking up was just what you did when something needed saying. She taught me that lesson, and now I was sharing it with others. The community center job became more than just work. I helped develop programs that actually addressed what families needed, not what people in offices thought they needed. I connected parents to resources, helped them navigate bureaucracy, advocated for them when systems failed. I understood their frustration, their exhaustion, their fear because I'd lived it. And because I'd lived it, I could help them believe things could get better. Emma's education fund grew. Mr. Morrison made additional contributions on her birthday each year. But more than the money, he stayed present in her life in small ways. He'd send her books he thought she'd enjoy, attend her school performances when I mentioned them, treat her like she mattered. Not as charity, but as genuine care for a kid who taught his family an important lesson. The scholarship committee at Emma's middle school contacted me when she was 12. They said Emma had been nominated for a district-wide youth leadership award. They wanted to know if they could use her story, the one from that dinner, as part of the nomination. I asked Emma what she thought. She shrugged in that way she had, and said it was fine if it helped other kids understand they could speak up too. She won the award. At the ceremony, she had to give a short speech. I sat in the audience, my heart pounding with pride and nervousness for her. She stood at the podium, still small for her age, and talked about courage. She said courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about being scared but doing the right thing anyway. She said she'd been terrified that night at the Morrison house, afraid of making things worse for her mom, afraid of all those adults staring at her. But staying silent felt worse than being scared. She talked about me then, about watching me work so hard, sacrifice so much, stay quiet to keep us safe. She said she realized that day that safety isn't worth much if you lose yourself to get it. She said sometimes protecting the people you love means taking risks. The audience, full of parents and teachers and students, gave her a standing ovation. I cried as usual, but these were good tears. The years passed. Emma got older, smarter, more confident. She never lost that core of quiet strength, but it was paired now with a voice she wasn't afraid to use. She started a program at her high school connecting students from different economic backgrounds, breaking down the barriers that made kids like her feel separate, less than. She organized food drives, tutoring programs, advocacy campaigns. She became exactly who I'd hoped she'd be. Someone who saw injustice and did something about it. Margaret's organization grew, and my role with them expanded. I became the director of community engagement, overseeing programs across the state. I hired other speakers, other people with lived experience, giving them the platform I'd been given. We created real change, influenced policies, shifted corporate cultures. Not everywhere, not perfectly, but enough to matter. The Morrison family's investment in Emma's education paid off when she got accepted to Yale University with a full scholarship. The college fund they'd started would cover expenses beyond tuition, books, living costs, all the little things that make education accessible. When the acceptance letter came, Emma and I sat in our apartment, the same small place we'd lived in all those years, and cried together. Mrs. Morrison hosted a celebration dinner for Emma's acceptance. This time, I was a guest, not staff. I sat at that same dining room table where everything had changed years before, but now as an equal. The other guests were there to celebrate my daughter, to honor her achievements. Tyler was there too, graduated now and working in community development, genuinely changed by that night and its aftermath. During dinner, Mr. Morrison stood to make a toast. He talked about how one evening had transformed his family's perspective, how a brave little girl had shown them what really mattered. He said Emma had given them a gift that night, the gift of seeing their own blindness, and he was grateful for it. He raised his glass to Emma, to her future, to the person she'd become. Emma stood them, unplanned. She thanked the Morrisons for their support, for the college fund, for caring about her future. But then she turned to me. She said the real person to thank was her mum, who'd shown her every single day what real strength looked like, what sacrifice meant, what it took to raise a child right in circumstances that made it nearly impossible. She said I was her hero, not because of any one brave moment, but because of thousands of quiet, brave moments strung together across years. I couldn't speak. I just sat there crying while my daughter, this incredible human I'd somehow raised, told a room full of people that I mattered, that I'd always mattered, that being a housekeeper, being poor, being invisible to most people, none of that diminished my worth or my impact on the person who mattered most. The dinner ended differently than that first one had. There was laughter, genuine warmth, real connection across the class divides that usually kept people like me separate from people like them. When we left that night, Emma and I drove home in the car I'd been able to buy with my better salary, past familiar streets that felt different now, like we belonged instead of just survived. Before bed, Emma asked me if I ever regretted how hard things had been. I thought about it honestly. I told her there were a million things I wished had been easier, better, more secure. But I didn't regret any of it because every struggle, every sacrifice, every moment of fear or exhaustion, all of it had shaped both of us into who we were. And I liked who we were. She smiled and said she did too. Then she asked me something that caught me off guard. She asked if I was proud of myself, not just of her, but of me. I realized I'd spent years being proud of Emma, grateful for opportunities, relieved when things worked out. But I'd never really let myself feel proud of my own journey. I told her yes. Yes, I was proud. Proud that I'd kept us afloat when everything felt impossible. Proud that I'd raised a daughter who knew her worth and fought for others. Proud that I'd found my voice after years of silence. Proud that I'd turned one terrible evening into something that sparked real change for my family and for others. Emma hugged me tight and said good, because I should be. She said I taught her everything that mattered. Not through big speeches or dramatic gestures, but through the simple act of showing up every day and doing my best. She said watching me survive had taught her how to thrive. Now, years later, Emma is studying social policy at Yale. She wants to work in government, to create systemic change that helps families like ours. She calls me every Sunday, tells me about her classes, her friends, her dreams. She's dating a kind boy who treats her well. She's joined advocacy groups and service organizations. She's becoming the kind of person who changes the world, not through wealth or power, but through unwavering commitment to justice and dignity for everyone. I still work at the community center, still speak at events, still share my story with anyone who'll listen. I've helped hundreds of families now, maybe thousands. Each time I connect someone to resources, advocate for them with bureaucracy, help them see their own worth. I think about that night, about how close I came to teaching Emma the wrong lesson, about how her courage in that moment rippled out into years of change. The Morrison family is part of our lives now, in that unexpected way that sometimes happens when people grow past their mistakes. We have dinner together a few times a year. Tyler brings his girlfriend, who works in education reform. Mrs. Morrison and I serve together on a non-profit board. Mr. Morrison mentors young entrepreneurs from disadvantaged backgrounds. They're not perfect people, none of us are, but they're trying. That night changed them too. Sometimes people ask me if I'm angry about those years I spent invisible, struggling, silent. I tell them honestly that I'm not anymore, because that struggle taught me things comfort never could. It taught me resilience and resourcefulness, and the true meaning of strength. It taught me that dignity doesn't come from circumstances, it comes from within. It taught me that my voice matters, that every voice matters, that silence protects nothing but the status quo. But mostly, those hard years taught me that courage can come from anywhere. From an 8-year-old girl with a fever and a blanket, from a mother who finally learns to speak up, from a family willing to examine their own failures, from a community that decides to do better. That dinner party was supposed to be the worst night of my life, and for a few hours, it was. But my daughter turned it into something else entirely. She turned humiliation into transformation. She turned cruelty into compassion. She turned one family's reckoning into a ripple that spread far beyond that dining room. I think about the woman I was before that night, how small I felt, how invisible. I think about Emma standing in that doorway, deciding in that moment that her mother's dignity mattered more than her own safety. I think about how one act of courage opened doors I didn't know existed, created possibilities I couldn't have imagined. This isn't a fairy tale. Our lives didn't become perfect. We still have struggles, still face challenges, still live in a world that makes things harder than they should be for people without resources. But we're not invisible anymore. We're not silent. And that changes everything. If this story touched you, subscribe to the channel and comment below which part moved you most. And before you go, there's a recommended video right here that will give you chills. Watch it now. Have you ever judged someone and then discovered you were wrong? Have you ever found courage in an unexpected moment? Have you ever watched someone you love be braver than you thought possible? Think about it and share your story in the comments below.